Good morning. First of all, you will notice a subtle change in the title of my talk from the one that's in the program. I do think there's a need for improvement in all vaccines, but it would be a great challenge to address all of these needs in 1 hour. So we're going to concentrate on our favorite vaccine, or if not the favorite vaccine, the one we examine most closely. And I represent in talking a group here in the Department of Epidemiology who have performed so well as a team in the last few years that we almost don't have to think about who is going to do what, because we know that all of our needs are going to be taken care of as we move forward in vaccine evaluation. And I will ask all of the group to stand up at the end of my talk to be recognized for the work we have done recently in evaluating vaccines and also bringing to life again the study of respiratory infections in the community, because what we've done recently was something that many people said couldn't be done, and that is to examine households and their respiratory infections the way things were done, or with modifications, the way things were done 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 years ago, close to 50 years ago in our studies in Tecumseh. But let me get back to the situation with influenza vaccines. Let's see. How do I advance?
I think you may have to hit the record button before I let you. I might need to leave just for a second.
Oh, okay. Well, I hit the page up or page down and not the other one. Okay. You've heard the term universal vaccines. That term was used last night in talking about influenza vaccines. And after you examine the situation, you realize that everybody means something else by universal vaccines. And why do we need universal vaccines? Where did this whole concept come from? And we'll work our way through this before we start looking at the past history of influenza vaccines and why we really do need improved vaccines. And the term universal vaccines really originated when it was realized that we had in the last decade the situation where we had H5N1 viruses circulating in Asia, avian viruses, which we originally believed could not spread directly to people. We discovered they could spread to people, and when they did, they caused very severe disease. So the concern was, we're going to have a pandemic. We're not going to be ready with vaccines because vaccines, influenza vaccines, have to be, as in the first bullet, specific to the virus that's circulating. We need to have vaccines that are ready to go. And that's where the concept of universal vaccines originated. And let's work our way through this and see what the different needs would be for vaccines for a pandemic and vaccines for seasonal disease, because we've lumped all these together. And in many ways that's a mistake because the needs are different. It would be great if they were the same, if we could have one universal vaccine for all purposes. But chances are we're never going to be able to achieve that. And the world of influenza vaccine improvement has pretty well split recently into the incrementalists, those who think that we're going to move gradually to better vaccines, and those who think that there's going to be a big bang. We're going to be able to come up with a single vaccine that's going to cover all the bases. And as you could tell from my description of the two camps, you can figure out where I come in. And that's why I think we need to start moving and improving our influenza vaccines. And I'll make the case for why we need that as we go through the history. So it's got to be specific. And that's the reason for our new improved vaccine, the quadrivalent vaccine. We've had trivalent vaccines up to now, 2A's and 1B, and because of lineage issues, that we have two lineages of B that are circulating, which are almost as different from each other as the two subtypes of A that we have in the vaccine, H3N2 and H1N1. We needed a quadrivalent vaccine, and this really was an easy fix, especially since we're at the point of almost overcapacity for influenza vaccine production. So putting another component in the vaccine was an easy fix. When there is a shift, as I mentioned, with a new subtype emerging, we need a newly formulated vaccine. And the last time this happened was 2009. And as you remember, the vaccine didn't become generally available until after the second wave. Here in Ann Arbor, we had mainly the first wave in May and June. Second wave, which occurred in peripheral areas of the state of Michigan and other places, happened afterwards. But the vaccine, aside from flu mist, which came earlier because it's easier to produce, really didn't arrive until after the second wave had just about ended. Coming back to seasonal, we know that the vaccine efficacy drops when there is a drift. So it would be great if we had vaccines of broader immunity. We have to give the vaccine every year. So we would also like to see vaccine of longer duration. And there's been almost every year at WHO a meeting on vaccines of broader efficacy and longer duration, because they really go hand in hand. If you have a vaccine of longer duration, there's going to be some degree of drift during that period, so you need it to be broader in terms of its coverage. But coming back to what the ideal would be, a universal vaccine, as it was originally thought, would protect against all influenza vaccines. That shouldn't be vaccines. You never realize the errors in your PowerPoints, no matter how many times you look at them, until you're up speaking. The influenza viruses, past and future, and that protection would be long-term. So it would be great if we could give a vaccine every 5 years or every 10 years and would protect against everything going along. So is this possible? How universal is universal? How long will it take? Francis Collins got up in front of a hearing, a budget hearing in Congress, and said we'd have universal vaccines in 5 years. And a few hours later, my phone rings and USA Today is on the call and on the phone asking me, do you agree with the 5-year prediction? And I tried to say something tactful about we always need goals. But it was a little bit awkward because even the editorial staff at USA Today, and there's only one science reporter now, part-time, recognized that this was a bit optimistic. And as I was saying before, is there a need for an interim approach? And you know how I'm going to come down on that. So let's look at needs in a pandemic. We need broad immunity. And we learned about this in terms of working on the H5N1. Because by the time vaccines were being developed, different clades had been recognized, and it was recognized that if you're going to have pre-pandemic vaccines, or even a vaccine produced, pre-pandemic vaccines, which to me means giving the vaccine to risk groups before the virus has emerged. You clearly need to have something that's broad, because what emerges is not necessarily what you have circulating before in animals. Even for stockpiling, for use after the pandemic virus manifests itself, you need breadth, because what you have in your stockpile is not going to match identically with what circulates. So this became a focus, and one of the things, and this is the low-hanging fruit, that was identified was that with adjuvants, you do two things. You get greater breadth, and you also answer the problem in bullet number 2. You don't want to use a whole lot of antigen, because this means that you're going to have less vaccine for use. If you need 15 or 90 micrograms in the vaccine, then you're not going to be able to give it to as many people as if you need 5 micrograms or 3.8 micrograms or whatever. So this is a need in a pandemic, and it's difficult to remember what was going on during the 2009 pandemic. There were accusations from Europe coming to the United States that because we didn't have an adjuvanted vaccine and we were using the standard 15 micrograms in the vaccine, we were using up all of the antigen that could be used for the developing world. What happened subsequently is everything was turned on its head, and now the manufacturers of the European vaccine are accused of using an adjuvant, especially one adjuvant, which causes harm. So you can't predict. One thing you learn about influenza is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know very much about influenza. So regulatory pathways were developed, and in 2009, in the middle of the pandemic, many of us thought we've crossed a bridge. We know how to antigen spare, get breadth using adjuvants, and then, and I'm not going to go into this today, the narcolepsy side effects were identified first in Finland and in other countries in Europe. So the concept of universal vaccine came from pandemic planning, but here is the key. And it's a little hidden thing that people don't really talk about, and that is, if you're facing a severe pandemic and there is the threat of high case fatality, you don't care if somebody comes down with mild flu. You want to prevent the severe complications. That's a goal. And as we look at the situation with seasonal vaccine, the question is that adequate? Are people going to be willing to have mild influenza when most influenza, while annoying and taking you out of the workforce is mild? And our answer, or my answer, is no. And we'll see that as we take our look across time to what's happened with influenza vaccine since it was first developed here. Now, with seasonal vaccine, the great revolution was the development of the PCR test. Because until we had the PCR test to identify infection, we dreamt that there was better vaccine efficacy than there really was. Because we were, and I'll talk about how we deluded ourselves that the vaccine was more effective than it really was. So antigen sparing is not an issue. We now have a high-dose vaccine for use in the older individuals, which is a clever way to get around the use of adjuvants, which would achieve the same or even better results. And the match does become an issue. We do need broader vaccines. And duration of protection is an issue. So both are an issue here. And as I said before, can we accept a vaccine, a universal vaccine for seasonal use that only reduces severity of illnesses? And I've talked to some groups at pharmaceutical companies, and one of the problems that you don't realize is that if you're going to go to regulatory authority to license such a vaccine, how do you define severity of illness? And those of our group who've worked on this issue know it is very hard, even with planning in advance on the indicators that you're going to use to define severity to do so. So this is a real problem in terms of dealing with seasonal influenza in clinical trials where you have a reasonable sample size. If you're going to define it in terms of pneumonia, that's a different story, but even recent studies looking at prevention of influenza in older individuals, their sample sizes were not necessarily driven by preventing pneumonia, and those that have had problems. Some real or predictable and some unpredictable, like having a pandemic occur in the middle of a trial. Okay, let's go back to the start. And very few people realize that it all started here. And it all started with Salk and Francis doing clinical trials during the Second World War on influenza prevention in the military. And from 1943 to 1969, all of the influenza development programs in the United States were military-based. The Armed Forces Epidemiologic Board supervised these trials, and it was a small circle of individuals. The concept of peer review didn't exist in those days. Conducted all these trials, and it was a small group talking to each other. Things opened up at the end of this period with NIH and CDC taking over the support of influenza vaccine development. So this was a bivalent vaccine with two H1N1s. H1N1 was the predominant type A strain, PR8, which is still used in the laboratory, and Weiss, which was a contemporary virus included, and also a B strain. It was it says here placebo-controlled design. Actually, it was much more of an observed control design, but with randomization, so that certain groups were put on vaccine and some were not. They did antibody determinations. It's amazing, 1943, how much of what we know now was identified in this first trial. Outbreak was early, they were lucky. They used a combined endpoint. And the fact that there really was little ability to identify infections. Remember, they didn't have cell culture at this point. They only had eggs. How do you identify infection? So they did some virus identification. They were not looking at rise in antibody titer, which is an issue in many of the later trials. They were looking at identification of virus, but in a subset. And just to give you an idea of what was going on, this is in the original paper, and it was done here on the campus because they were pushing through students to give them a bachelor's degree because you couldn't be an officer without being a gentleman, and also having a university degree in those days. So they were pushed through sessions during the summer and then sent out. And this is what the outbreak looked like. Controls and vaccinated. And if we do a calculation based on this, we see that the efficacy is around 70%. And they didn't do calculations like that. This was really early days. But let's see how early the outbreak peaked. So this is an average early, which comes around Christmas or before Christmas. And we talk about early years, but early years happen a fair amount. And this is a very interesting depiction, and was the first indication that hemagglutination inhibiting antibody predicts protection, both in the vaccinated and in the unvaccinated. You have to look at this and figure out what they're talking about, but this is really what this PowerPoint says, and we really haven't come all that far in terms of our correlates of immunity since that time. So this is 1943. Higher the antibody, the greater protection you have. And also, I should mention, the point was made, which we've re-identified recently, that those who fail vaccination often have high titers. You usually hear people saying, well, there's people who fail vaccination because they haven't responded all that well. Nearly everybody who fails vaccination has got high titers. And we've shown that in a number of different studies, mainly concentrating on H3N2 because that's what we get most of. So people fail even with high HI titers, and that was a point in this study, which means we need to look for more correlates of protection. Okay, these are all the military trials. And there's the first one with 71 or 72% on the left, going across, and it was found, as in the trial, that you see about 35% protection when there's drift. When the virus changes, you don't get as good protection. But if you look at the length of the bars, you see that it looks like it's 70 to 90% protection. And until very recently, if you read the ACIP influenza recommendations, it said that the vaccine was 70 to 90% effective, based on these studies. There was only one problem with this, and that is that nearly all of the studies used a serologic endpoint. When you get infected, ordinarily, with a virus, and this is one of the nice things that in working with viruses, where you're looking mainly at one particular antibody, such as anti-hemagglutinin. If you're infected, you get a rise in antibody titer, a fourfold rise in antibody titer, and it is much easier to do this, especially if you have nothing but eggs or then cell culture to identify actual infection, to look at the rise in titer as your endpoint. You get a lot bloods before the season and after the season. You look to see who's infected. And in many of these military studies, they extrapolated, and they didn't really look. They looked at clinical endpoints, and what they did was clinical disease confirmed by rise in antibody titer and extrapolated. Even during this period, there was a debate about whether this was appropriate and whether there wasn't bias introduced by the fact that when you get influenza vaccine, you get an enormous rise in HI titer, and can you really go up from this higher titer to demonstrate infection? And there was an argument between Thomas Francis, who thought that this was appropriate, and Alex Langmuir, who was the head of the Epidemic Intelligence Service at CDC, who felt you really needed a clinical endpoint. Well, we did something which is so simple and is now being quoted widely. And the first author is Josh Petrie, a doctoral student in our group. And we looked at our clinical trial, which I'll go over in a little while, that we conducted with live attenuated and activated vaccine for 4 years. And we looked because we had PCR to identify infection. As I said, PCR availability has revolutionized the influenza field as it has other fields. Made studies in developing countries feasible, all sorts of things. So placebo, and the way this happened, and Rachel Cross is here, who does our HIs, and we heard that we didn't have all that good correlation between PCR-defined infection and rise in titer. What was going on? So we just looked, it's very simple epidemiology, at the we stratified by what vaccine they received or whether they got placebo. So we had 90% of those with PCR positives in the placebo group had a rise, 87% with live attenuated, and as we're going to say, live attenuated really has poor correlates of protection. They don't get rises in HI antibody, but if they're infected, you find it. But only 23% of those who failed, these are PCR positive, inactivated influenza vaccine. And we're now calling this IIV instead of TIV because it's now no longer trivalent. It's inactivated influenza vaccine. So if you see that abbreviation, you got to know what it means. So there is systematic bias in these studies. So now we know we really don't have 70 to 90% efficacy but that doesn't mean we don't have efficacy. And some people have thrown out the baby with the bathwater because there was basically this bias, and they have said there is no efficacy. So we've got to look at placebo-controlled efficacy trials. You're using viral identification endpoints for LAIV, live attenuated, and now IIV. And we're going to focus on the live attenuated. This is the flu mist developed by John Basab here. And this is the first pivotal study done in young children, where there was more than 90% efficacy. This was an isolation endpoint, virus isolation. And they even prevented febrile otitis media in the vaccinated group. Very interestingly, there's a study with Tamiflu, oseltamivir, in which treatment of young children prevents otitis media at about the same frequency. So otitis media is not just bacterial. It's viral as well. RSV, you find it. Those children who get otitis media, and there are some children who get otitis media and some who don't, and there are studies about that, they will get otitis media, whatever the infecting agent is. And then, this is another subsequent pivotal study in which they compared, this is relative efficacy, they compared live attenuated vaccine to inactivated vaccine. Relative efficacy, no placebo. So the numbers that you see, and let's look at regardless of match, because we're beginning to understand that we don't understand drift. That drift is a much more complicated issue than we used to think because of receptor specificity and all sorts of issues. They're now doing cross-HI tests using oseltamivir in the diluent because they find that there's some receptor specificity issues, what red cells you use. It's very complicated. So let's just look at regardless of match. And basically you see that H3N2, H1N1 vaccines, live attenuated is around 80% better than inactivated vaccine, but not B. B looks about the same. And this is perhaps a lineage issue, but it doesn't look like, because with well-matched it was only 27% with very wide confidence intervals, so maybe a little better for B, but not a whole lot, which is a little paradoxical based on some of our recent observations. And because of all this, ACIP made a recommendation this year, a preferential recommendation for live attenuated influenza vaccine in young children. And I'm going to go and take a fast forward to the current U.S. flu networks of which we are a part, and look at, this is observational studies, and I put this here without an explanation for how we do these studies, which I'll come back to shortly. But this is medically attended influenza in various years. And you can see that efficacy was good in the past, but this past year, which was an H1N1 year, there was no efficacy of live attenuated. This has been reproduced in other studies, and now it's been disseminated in MMWR, and there's no good explanation for this. We can hypothesize, as usual, extensively on the basis of these observations, but I think there are some issues of infectivity, of other things associated with using a live vaccine that you reassort every year, in which you really don't know if you're selecting for growth in eggs, which is the way the strains are selected, what you're going to get in terms of antigenicity and antibody production or whatever protection, because we're not sure exactly how these vaccines protect. a cautionary note with statements coming out from CDC just yesterday about these observations. Okay, let's talk about our studies here on young adults, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, otherwise I'll be talking all morning. And we did these studies, and they're important because this gives us an idea using modern endpoints, PCR endpoints, what the efficacy of the vaccine is in the optimal setting, young adults. And we did this study and got NIH funding because we felt that there was not enough evidence for how well LAIV worked in young adults. There was only one study which had no virologic endpoints, and we set this up with a hypothesis that the live attenuated would be better than inactivated vaccine. And we did the study over a 4-year period, and I'll show you the first and the last years, which were the best in terms of the attack rate, and did the studies in 4 universities in Michigan. And Suzanne Oman, my colleague, was the one who really worked this, and Chris Victor actually was involved as well when he was here as a doctoral student and also as a postdoc. So it was randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, 18 to 49 years. We used a 5-to-1 randomization because we wanted to see failures of inactivated and live attenuated vaccine. It's not as efficient design if you're just looking for tight confidence intervals, but if you want to study failures, and the only way to study to determine what predicts protection is to look at failures, because you don't know that somebody who looks like they didn't get infected, whether they've actually been exposed to the influenza virus. You only know that they've been exposed if they fail. Okay. It was mainly a somewhat, and this got published in the New England Journal, and we called this a drifted year in the title. And now, looking back, it wasn't as drifted as they used to think, because they've changed the definition of how much of a difference in cross-HI test is required to call it a drift. All right, and these are the key outcomes, and culture or PCR positive, and we were learning about not using a serologic endpoint at this time. We actually had it in the protocol, which was FDA approved. This was done under IND. And you can see TIV versus placebo. This is an absolute protection comparing to placebo, 75%, 48% for LAIV, and TIV versus LAIV. TIV is 53% better than live attenuated in this study. And I'll skip over A versus B and fast forward to year 4, where we called the first year a miracle study because we were underpowered. We were supposed to get 2,000 people, and we got 1,200 and some odd, and the flu season came while we were still vaccinating, so we had to exclude some individuals and work with the time component as part of the analysis. But here we're fully enrolled. And again, it was mainly an H3N2 year. We had only one H1N1, some B, and we really couldn't say a whole lot about the match of the B because we really didn't have enough. It wasn't sized large enough to look at the B as an outcome. And this is, again, a summary. And we found about 68% second row, TIV versus placebo, 68% effective. Only 36% for LAIV, and here it's statistically significant that the live attenuate, that the inactivated was 50% better in this young adult population than the live attenuated. Now, I think the take-home lesson here is that under the best of circumstances, and let's just focus on inactivated vaccine from here on, is about 70% effective in the best of circumstances. And you probably can't read this, but if you would like to examine this often quoted paper from Mike Osterholm, he makes the comment that there is no evidence, aside from LAIV in young children, that influenza vaccines protect. And does a summary of the clinical trials. What you will find if you look carefully at this is he is using the second one, which says 16% efficacy. That was our second year where we had extremely low attack rates. We couldn't have said anything. We had very wide confidence intervals. It's included as a negative trial. And what I would conclude is that we need better vaccines, and not that we haven't shown efficacy. And when you get Mike off his soapbox, that's really what he will conclude as well. He just believes that if you take an extreme position, you'll get more attention and therefore be able to convince the world. But in the process, and this is what the problem we have with influenza vaccines now, how can we promote vaccines on a year-to-year basis if we're saying, people are saying we have no evidence that they work? Okay. Now, the new studies. And I'll move very quickly through these because some of them are very old. But this is the new design. Why? We can't do randomized controlled trials every year. We have a universal recommendation now. We can't do placebo-controlled studies. So the first studies that were done, and we were involved in them years ago, to get the influenza vaccine covered by Medicare Part B. And what we did was we looked in the influenza season at those who were hospitalized for influenza and pneumonia, looked outside the influenza season, didn't have PCR endpoints, just had a clinical endpoint, and did an effectiveness calculation. These are effectiveness studies because they're not randomized controlled trials, they're observational, with all the biases that an observational study would have because people select themselves or are selected by their caregivers to be vaccinated. And this is above age 65, and these are the results we got. We got 45% effectiveness in the influenza season, only 21% outside, which was not statistically significant. We did have transmission of influenza during this outside period. Other years, we got about 30% with no protection outside the influenza season, which is great because if you see protection from influenza vaccine when there's no influenza circulating, then your models, your statistical models aren't working. You've got confounding, all sorts of other issues. Now, I'm going to skip over some of the other studies which came to the same result, same outcome during the same time period, and move to one that has had enormous implications in terms of failed messaging. Kristen Nickel in Minnesota has done studies over the years, and she looked and not only at protection against pneumonia and influenza in the elderly, this is all older individuals, but also looked at all-cause mortality. And I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look at the bottom line, you will see that in these estimates there was 50% reduction in all-cause winter mortality produced by influenza vaccine. Only one problem with this. It didn't matter if you had many underlying conditions or no underlying condition, there was still 50% reduction in all-cause winter mortality. And saying that doesn't fit with what we're observing in terms of the world or the increased use of influenza vaccine, and we're not seeing that much of a decrease in pneumonia and influenza hospitalization. So Lisa Jackson and her group, see, the issue was the model. And the assumption here was that vaccinated individuals were more susceptible because they had more underlying conditions, and therefore they were getting vaccinated. And the unvaccinated were healthier. And therefore, when you put them in a logistic regression model, you got adjustment, and it made the vaccine look effective. And it was effective, and this hardly appeared in the papers, not only in the influenza season, but outside the influenza season, which produced studies by Lisa Jackson and her colleagues in Seattle, where they looked at deaths and prevention of influenza after vaccination in the late season, before influenza hit, and they found there was protection against mortality even before influenza occurred. And actually, for various statistical reasons, was highest before, dropped during influenza season, and dropped further later. So this was, and now is recognized as confounding. And the reason this was the case, they did record review, was they found that those who received influenza vaccine were actually healthier than those who did not receive influenza vaccines. There are some people who think that this was an overstatement, but clearly the 50% reduction in winter mortality is not really reliable. So I'm going to skip all of this and move to the present. PCR studies. This is the U.S. Flu VE network, of which, as you can see, we are a part. And this is the source of data that we're getting now. And the findings, as you can see, are that we are really in the range of 45 to 60% protection against influenza in these observational studies which have PCR outcomes which work in medically attended illnesses in various outpatient sites. And we can divide it by age. Some years varies by year. But the consistent finding the consistent finding, and these are the results from the 2011-12 year in which we took the lead. The consistent finding is that we do worse with H3N2 than we do with H1N1. And what was interesting here is that the vaccine virus was Victoria, and we did better in protecting against the non-vaccine virus, but the confidence intervals overlap than in against the vaccine virus. But we're dealing with vaccines that protect, but don't protect as well as we would like. When we compare influenza vaccine to hepatitis A vaccine and other vaccines, they seem to protect against 90-95%. And here it is broken down by years. As I was saying, H3N2 is a problem, and it may well be because of egg adaptation and changes in the virus that occur with egg adaptation, although that's not totally clear. And there are studies like this being done all over the world now. There's another issue that's come up, and we were among the first to identify it in our household study. And that is, you seem to be better protected if you get the vaccine in the current year but haven't got the vaccine in the prior year. This is probably, at least in part, because there is carryover protection associated with prior year vaccination, but might have something to do with clonal selection when you're giving the same vaccine or a very similar vaccine in a second year. And this is something which has showed up in a number of different studies. Another reason for a broader vaccine, longer duration vaccine that can be given in more than an individual year. It's not just the logistics of giving vaccine every year. And in our household study, we are able to do serology, HI serology. And here it is showing that for the type A's, those who were vaccinated in the current year have lower titers. Who were vaccinated in both years have lower titers than those who were vaccinated in the single year. We also have the issue that people who get vaccinated, these are observational. Those who get vaccinated, and this is now coming out in Journal of Infectious Diseases. Those who are vaccinated every year are a bit different than those who get vaccinated not regularly. And these are observational data, and this is why it's very important to try to correlate this with serology and other findings. And I'm going to skip over this. We're now looking at neuraminidase, anti-neuraminidase antibody as a predictor of protection. And Emily Martin and Emily Johnson in our lab is very much involved with doing these neuraminidase antibody studies. And as you can see, as antibody titer goes up, protection against, and this is anti-neuraminidase antibody. And it looks like an anti-neuraminidase antibody is an independent predictor of protection. Okay, we need new influenza vaccines. We all agree with this. But my final point is that this is Peter Doshi's article, which appeared in the BMJ, in which you have to read very carefully to realize it's an op-ed piece, it was not refereed. And what he is saying is that this is all a conspiracy. We really don't have a whole lot of influenza around. And it's all the manufacturers saying that we have in conspiracy with CDC and other groups, saying that there's a lot of influenza so they can sell vaccine every year. Marketing vaccine by marketing disease. And you can read that, and I suggest that you go and read this, because what he's doing is totally misinterpreting data. And you can see what he's done. Oh, there's no flu around. The other thing he does, he looks at percent ILI, influenza-like illness. How much of it is really flu? Not much of it's really flu, because this is based on specimens submitted. And these are and this is accepted, even an op-ed has to be accepted for publication by a major medical journal. This is destructive because, okay, you can go after the vaccines, say we need better vaccines. We shouldn't be recommending vaccines until we have better vaccines. But to say we don't have very much flu, and flu's not a problem, this is totally destructive and is being allowed to occur in some of our major journals. Okay, where are we going? And I thank my colleague Rick Bright. And you can't really say very much from this. All you know is that there's a reasonably big pipeline. How many of these potential vaccines are truly universal? And there are not very many. And they're not far down in the pipeline. The good news, and Rick Bright is at BARDA, is that BARDA, their mission is to control bioterrorist threats. But pandemic influenza is interpreted as bad or worse than a bioterrorist threat, and therefore it's part of their mandate. So they are pushing development of improved influenza vaccine. They are the ones who have sponsored a production facility which produces cell culture-based vaccine for seasonal use. And the justification there is that it would be quicker to produce pandemic vaccine at that site, but in the process we get improved seasonal vaccines. So there is hope going forward. There is attention, and there is, in addition, a big budget being invested in improved influenza vaccine. And the question is the timeline, and our goal, and I think, fortunately, a lot of the thinking is coming around to a gradualist approach that we're not going to have a big bang, the single solution to at least type A influenza. So, in conclusion, we've overestimated influenza vaccines over the years. It's probably more like 60 to 70% efficacious in young adults. We've had uncontrolled confounding, and saying overestimating doesn't do a whole lot of good for public confidence, especially when, with a PCR test, people in decision-making places who've received influenza vaccine can confirm they are vaccine failures. And that's part of what's been going on. We have been able to identify vaccine failures so much more easily with the PCR test than we ever were before. We could always say, oh, it wasn't really influenza, it was something else. And we all agree, those of us in the field, that we need improved influenza, but critiques have reached a dangerous level, and we all have to band together to try to moderate, control these kinds of crazy, truly crazy observations crusades against influenza as an entity, not simply influenza control. And I'd like our influenza group please to stand up so we can all join in recognizing them. And there's Suzette.